Hi, my name is Mary Owen, and the book that I read for this project was When Bad Things Happen to Good People by Harold Kushner. Kushner is a rabbi that experienced losing his son to a genetic disease called progeria, which is a disease that causes children to age very rapidly and die young. Kushner's family found out that his son Aaron had the disease at the age of 3, and then Aaron passed away at the age of 14. All of that is important to this presentation, as well as to future social work practice, because the themes and lessons from this book could be applied to clients facing similar experiences to Kushner's family. Kushner is a parent that has lost a child, and a parent that has lost a child due to a diagnosis that greatly impacted Aaron's quality of life. In my future work, I might encounter families that are experiencing similar things. In addition to this book, in addition to this, the book has an interesting perspective for people that have experienced tragedy that also have strong faith. The book dives into Kushner's thoughts on how the common mindset of faith is to be good in the eyes of God and he will be good to you, which is incredibly disheartening for people that have experienced a loss or a tragedy. Kushner's thoughts on the role that God plays in tragedies can help grieving people understand that he is not punishing them or giving them something that they deserve, but that he is there to help them through their hardships. This is important to social work practice in the event that I might work with grieving clients that have a strong relationship with their faith or with God. Um, and so if they're struggling with this relationship after experiencing a loss or a death, um, either recommending this book or talking about some of the themes from the book might help them to reframe or restore their relationship with God. So this book is a nonfiction book because it's a self-help book that's written by Kushner, which is based on his thoughts and his experiences surrounding faith, especially when it comes to people dealing with loss or tragedy. Um, it's really neat because he references works um, such as the Bible or other writings that have come from connections to Bible stories, as well as he discusses real events from his life. So, like his own personal experience with losing his son and dealing with his son's diagnosis, as well as the fact that he's a rabbi. So, he has spent a lot of time in his career helping families or individuals from his community that have experienced some type of loss or some type of tragedy. So earlier, I provided a little information on Kushner and why he wrote the book, but now I'll talk a little bit more about the synopsis of the book. So this book is a reflection on the relationship of people with a background in faith experiencing tragedy. As I mentioned previously, in addition to losing his son, Kushner is a rabbi that is often called to support his community through tragedies. Um, and so he highlights that oftentimes in the face of tragedy, people will ask, why did God do this to me? Um, and then throughout the book, Kushner will reference the Bible or works related to the Bible, as well as experiences to highlight lessons that support the idea or to draw a contrast to biblical works that highlight this idea that if you are a good person with a strong relationship with God, you will be rewarded and not punished. Um, so Kushner goes on to talk about how this notion or this idea that if you are a good person and you do right by God, that good things will happen to you. Um, that it's really hard to believe in our society because random tragedies happen all the time, and they can happen to even the most kindest, or the most pious people in the world. Um, so he shares that in our society, finding meaning in everything is incredibly important too. But this notion is also incredibly hard for people who have experienced a tragedy because they might be thinking that they're responsible for what happened, or they might blame themselves or God or others for the tragedy. So through the references from the Bible and his own experiences and reflections from others about the Bible, Kushner proposes the concept that God is not in control of what happens to us, but is there as a guide to help us through the tough times that we face. So he highlights that God is not responsible for the tragedies, which is often sometimes something that people think when it comes to faith, that God has a plan for everyone and God does everything for a reason and God is in control of everything. But instead of this, Kushner proposes that God is simply in control of the resiliency and the support that people have after a tragedy or what comes next. So Kushner proposes the idea that rather than asking God, why did this happen to me, that some of the other questions that might be more important or might be more healing for people who are experiencing loss is asking, how do we respond? Or what will we do next after the loss? What will God do to help us through this? So I've mentioned it already, but the most important lesson that I took from this book is that Kushner is proposing this different perspective on faith for those that have experienced tragedy, um, rather than one that focuses on like, why did God do this to me? So after experiencing a tragedy, an individual's relationship with God might change. So they might be angry or they might question why God has done this to them, even if they've been super devoted to their faith. And so they might be feeling that God's response is to give them pain and sorrow. Um, and this comes from Kushner's own experience, in which he writes how creating this book helped him to create more meaning after the death of his son Aaron. So the quote that I have here is, I would write it for all those people who wanted to go on believing, but whose anger at God made it hard for them to hold on to their faith and be comforted by religion. So I think this is important because Kushner's words, again, with his own experience, so he can be very relatable to people who have experienced loss and also relatable to people who do have strong faith. He can act as a way to help people that are angry with God after a loss to reconsider their relationship with him after it. Um, I feel like this lesson holds the most impact because it can be super helpful for people who are questioning their faith after experiencing a tragedy. Um, Kushner's words can also help people reflect on their relationship as God with God, as well as the role that he plays in tragedy. Like I mentioned before, um, in a lot of religion, or it's just generally assumed by a lot of people that God has a plan and God is in control of everything. And so he does everything for a reason. And throughout the book, Kushner really argues that God isn't necessarily the one responsible for all of the tragedy that people face, but he does play a role in how the tragedy is dealt with afterwards. So another lesson that I think is really important from the book um, is when Kushner shares that his thoughts or shares his thoughts on the role that God plays in tragedies, like I previously mentioned. Um, so he highlights that he doesn't necessarily believe that God has the control or the ability to dole out the illnesses or the disasters or the other tragedies that happen in the world. But he's responsible for the response afterwards. Um, so in the book, Kushner makes the point that he thinks that what God does is he makes it um, so that there are people who provide support after a tragedy, or people who can help manage the awful things that happen in the world. So he talks about how he feels like it was God who helped create doctors or nurses or first responders or the people who do medical research on illness and disease to help prevent it from happening again. So like one that he references is like the people who helped to stop polio, who did the research and who helped distribute the vaccines to make sure that polio is not so much a tragedy that our modern world experiences, or most of our modern world experiences today. So a quote that I appreciate from the book is when Kushner is talking about prayer. And so as someone who like has come from a background in faith, prayer is something that is important, and something that is done. And a lot of times when there's like a tragedy or like illness or injury, it'll be praying for those people. And Kushner talks about how prayer is not so much a tool that should be used to ask God for something. So like if someone was sick with cancer, it's not so much praying that they get better, but prayer can be really powerful to help support people through the tough times that they're experiencing. And he feels that it's about community. So a quote is, prayer, when it is offered in the right way, redeems people from isolation. It lets them know that they are part of a greater reality with more depth, more hope, more courage, and more of a future than any individual could have by himself. So he goes on to talk about how during a tragedy, a lot of times people close to impacted individuals will often join together to pray. And so he'll talk about that might even be people from different areas of religion, different like faith backgrounds, all coming together to just share their words and talking about how it is a group of people who are coming together to show someone who is either dealing with grief or is bereaved or is struggling with something difficult in their life, that they're not alone and that they have other people with them who see their pain and want to show that they're there to sit with them through it and provide the support that they might need as they're dealing with this loss. So I think that this book is relevant to grief and what we've learned in class so far for a few reasons. So I mentioned previously, Kushner highlights that after a tragedy, people will be angry or find a scapegoat for what's happened. And so this goes with what we've talked about with Kubler-Ross and the stages of grief, specifically with one of the stages being anger. So people who have experienced a tragedy or a loss might be really angry and questioning God. Kushner himself, I think, reflects on after getting the diagnosis for his son's illness, like questioning like why did God do this to us? Or being angry about the fact that his son is not going to get the life that he had hoped for, which is also something that we've talked about in the book and in our class. And so then he goes on to note that a lot of times this scapegoat can be God, which Kushner tries to help repair that relationship for people who are dealing with this. Another aspect that's really important is that he highlights the guilt and blame that people place on themselves during or after a tragedy, which can be common in individuals that are grieving. So there might be people who are thinking to themselves, like he mentions in the book, almost like we skipped going to our church service last week, or like we didn't fast during this last like holy time, and then questioning if like maybe that's why their son died, or that they experienced a tragedy. Or people might be thinking to themselves after a loss, if I had just been a better mother, maybe this would not have happened. And so then Kushner goes on to help people who understand this tragedy, that it's not their fault and it's not something that God is doing to try to punish them for something. Um, that there's more to God and what he is in control or not in control of that can help people to that can help people to not not feel this way. And so this book also provides insight on how to support grieving individuals. Um, and so he talks a bit about some of the ways that people maybe don't do the best to support someone who has experienced a grief or a loss, which we had talked about both in the text and just through some of our other readings and assignments, of like things to say or not to say to someone who is experiencing a loss or grieving. And so in the text, Kushner mentions phrases that people might say to someone um, dealing with a tough time that say like, "Oh, God has a plan for all of us," or like God called her home because he needed her more, which can be really disheartening for the bereaved to hear. Like Kushner reflects on things like that by saying like, oh, like, like if I needed my son more, God wouldn't have taken him. Like that's not something that's really going to help me through this time. And so he talks about how a community or like individuals can sit with the bereaved and give them a space to really let out their feelings of anger or despair or other emotions. He references a lot throughout the book this biblical story about Job, which I'll talk about a bit more in this presentation later on. Um, but he just talks about how some of Job's friends, after experiencing this like major tragedy, he is talking about his frustration with God and how he's like, I can't believe God would do this to me. Like, I'm such a good person, or I try so hard. And some of his friends, their responses are like, oh, like you just have to trust that God's got a plan. And, like this happened for a reason. And really, Kushner and other authors since have reflected on, like Job just really needed in that moment people, his like friends, to be saying things like, hey, like I get that you're angry. This is incredibly frustrating. It's hard for us to understand why this happened too. What do you need as you're going through this? Which is something that's really important to help people who are dealing with grief. Like telling them that there's a reason for it, or that like if they just believe that it'll all work itself out, but that doesn't take away from the fact that they've experienced some type of tragedy, and it dismisses the anger or the sadness that they might be feeling during that time. um I felt that this book was more of a slow burn than like a quick read. I feel like it started off really interesting, but it really like kind of continued to reiterate the same point throughout the main parts of the book and then added a few more lessons towards the end. Um, I do also feel like personally, like I was raised Catholic, but I don't really consider myself a religious person or have a strong faith now. So I imagine that maybe if my relationship with faith was different, um, or if I had recently experienced a loss and was having like a question of my faith, the book might have been more of a fast read for me. Um, Although overall, I still thought it was very interesting and helped me to reflect or consider like my relationship between faith and grief from other viewpoints. As well as just kind of think about like reflect on my own personal relationship with faith over time. Um, the point that will stick with me the most, I think, is reframing um that notion that God isn't in control of what happens to us, but plays a role in how we handle what happens to us. Because as someone who was raised Catholic, I do really feel like the lesson that was passed down to me was like, be good and be good because God wants you to be good. And like, if you do that, then like good things will happen to you. Um, and like he will treat you well and he will treat you fair and you will have happiness. And so like growing up, I absolutely believe that God was responsible for everything and that a lot of the tragic things that happened were done because it was his plan and it was often either a punishment or a test of faith. And so even though I'm not as involved in my faith today, I like that this mindset that Kushner has helped me to switch to helps me think more that like that God isn't the one who's responsible for the tragedies and he's not there to cause all this destruction just happens, but that what God does in wake of all the tragedy and grief and loss in the world is plays a role in how people deal with the tragedy. um and so I think like for me personally too, like as a social worker, I've always kind of had the mindset that I do what I do, like I help others in this profession, not because like my faith told me to do so. So it's not like I joined social work because I know that helping others is like what God wants. Um, but because it's something that matters to me. But after reading this book, I kind of feel like maybe my perspective has changed a bit, and it's not that I'm doing this for God, but that if there is a God, God might have had a role in me choosing this profession so that I could help others who are dealing with some of the hardships that just happen in the world. Um, so I think that the book was very well written. Um, I like books that like the author gives their own voice to it. And I think he did a really good job using his voice as well as having the unfortunate but very necessary personal experience. Like with Kushner having dealt with the loss of his son after a debilitating illness, in addition to all of the times that he, as a rabbi, has helped his community through grief. I think that that really helped to respect his words and what he was saying. Um, but then in addition to this, he does a really good job connecting his thoughts and experiences to like other things that are very relevant to faith. So specifically, he talks a lot about biblical stories and things that are referenced in the Bible, um, and like reflections that people have had since that, which is so important to highlight, like why like so many of us have that notion of, we be good to God and God will be good to us, or like God is responsible for all and if you are wicked, you will be punished, which again so many people have that mindset that like God did this to me for a reason. But then Kushner is able to connect maybe where some of that there's like shortcomings in that, or there's gaps in where that is, and using references to help make more understanding of it. Um, and so as I brought up earlier, he talks a lot about this story from the Bible, with this person named Job, who is a person who is incredibly strong in his faith. And so it in like the story depicts him and he is a good person. And so in the story, God and the devil end up having a conversation where God's like showcasing like, look at Job, he's so great, he believes in me and he believes in all I do, and the devil's like, yeah, like he does, but he's doing it because he thinks he's going to get a reward, and so like if you take all of that away, Like, do you really think that he's still going to believe in you? And so God goes out to test him. And um, God takes away Job's fortune and causes all this tragedy. He kills off his children and he gives Job like these uncomfortable oils, and he gets rid of his house and his fortune. And so Job is left with almost nothing. Um, and despite the fact that his friends, like when Job seeks support from his friends say like how like you should turn your back on God, like he did this to you and you're such a good person, but like what did you get for it? Job continues to stay strong in his faith. And because of that, then God comes back and God basically was like, this was a test and you stood strong, so I'm going to give you more children and I'm going to give you a home and I'm going to give you so much wealth and good fortune for being so good to me. And so I mean like that story, like um people who use the Bible as like their holy text and something that guides them and their behavior and their character, um like that's super important because it tells us that through all of the hardships, like you've just got to be good to God or just believe in God and believe that he's got a plan in it and it'll all work out. But then Kushner shares how like in our society this isn't always the case. There are tragedies that happen to even the best of people, the most pious, or the people who don't do anything wrong, or who do such good things for society and they still have to deal with this loss. Or he also talks about how like maybe there's an afterlife and maybe all of this good will come in the afterlife, but it doesn't help you now when you've had such a tough loss that you are dealing with and you're feeling just so much despair and sorrow that like just knowing or having the idea of like, oh, but somewhere along the way it'll come back to me is a really hard concept to grasp. um and so another important aspect of it too is that then when these people experience this kind of loss, they're like, well, if I have to have that faith that God is giving good things to good people and punishing the wicked, am I not a good person? Um, and then they have that question of their faith. And so Kushner does a really good job to kind of like highlight the gaps in this, or how like the world is so much more complex than just what this Bible story has to say. Um and how like there is so much more that goes into whether you're like a good person or not based on the tragedies that you experience, um or like how dedicated you are to your faith. um and so it can be almost a sense of comfort for people who are just at a loss after the tragedies that have happened to them when it comes to their faith. So I think that this book would be really beneficial for people who are dealing with grief or loss. I think, though, it would be more specifically beneficial for people who maybe come from a background of strong faith or have like a really good relationship with their faith, or have recently questioned that relationship with faith due to a loss that they've experienced. Because like for me personally, like I do relate to the question of like why do bad things happen to good people, or like in the line of social work, like all the clients that I have who have just experienced awful things in their life, and then I have to sit there and I have to question like why did this happen to this child? Why did this happen to this family? Um but as somebody who leans more agnostic now, the book I think really leans into the connection of this question of why do good things happen to bad people, or why do bad things happen to good people, in relation to God. Um And so I think that it would be more beneficial for people who do have like a strong relationship with God, or a relationship that they're struggling with after the loss of a tragedy. Um, and so then again, with that, I did find myself in conflict with some of what the author was sharing. Um, but I think the fact that I was raised Catholic, and so my background did help me to see it from a religious perspective. And I greatly appreciated that, with how much of like scripture is just so important to at least like the Catholic faith. Um, Understanding like this is why so much of what our religion believes is why we feel this way, but here's how understanding it from a different viewpoint can help you make sense of these tragedies that occur, and like God's role in it. So I do feel like the goals of the author were very obvious, as that first quote that I mentioned, like he right off the bat at the beginning of the book writes writes like what his whole point is of why he's writing this book. And so throughout the book he's like, after everything that happened with Aaron and everything that we were dealing with, I knew I was going to write a book, because I wanted to help others who maybe felt the same way as me, who maybe have such a good relationship with God, or like him as a rabbi, he's like a very respected individual of his faith, and would definitely be seen as like a servant of God. And so he's writing this book as somebody, as a man of faith who has to navigate that faith after a tragedy. And so then his goal was to help others who might feel this way too, just how to manage their loss, or how to work through their grieving, and respond to their faith. And so this book helped me to see their perspectives of how people with faith might respond to loss. And I think that this book helped me to understand the questions and feelings that these individuals might experience after a loss, as well as the ways that I can support them as they grieve, specifically grief with their relationship with God. And so this book just does a really good job of providing a perspective of how faith and grief go together, and unique thoughts that come from people who come from this background. And so overall, this book is about reconsidering the question of, why do bad things happen to good people when it comes to grief and loss? So rather than asking this question, Kushner proposes the idea of asking questions of like, how do we respond to a tragedy? And like, what do we do after or because of the loss? And so like this makes me think of the people who um like families who have lost their children due to school shootings, who now have gone on to be advocates for gun control laws, or the people who have lost loved ones to a disease, who now go on to help raise money for research to a disease, or even Kushner, who lost his son, who now goes on to write this book to share his thoughts and perspectives on faith and grief. And he even mentions like this, like, I hate that this experience happened, but this experience has made me like a better rabbi and a better responder to my community when tragedy strikes. Um, and so while I don't have the strongest relationship with faith, I think that the lessons from this book can help like both secular and non-secular people reconsider tragedies and the meaning behind them. So it's as in, tragedy is not a punishment or a consequence for some type of behavior or a test of faith. It's just something that happens to us at random. And so there's not a higher power that's responsible for doling out these tragedies to people. but it's more that this higher power or God is responsible for providing us with this support and the resiliency that we need after a loss. So all of the people who are there to help you through the grief and the strength that you get to keep going after dealing with a loss. So I would recommend this book first and foremost to people that come from a background of faith and have experienced a loss, but I would also recommend it to anyone who sits there and has had the question, why do bad things happen to good people, or just like why do bad things happen in the world? And so this book connects to our course and the course objectives in a few ways. So first, it reflects on a spiritual component of grief and bereavement, which is unique to specific populations and backgrounds, cultures and spiritualities. So it discusses the faith-based theories around tragedy and grief and how they play a role in dealing with grief and loss. And so this book also gave me space to reflect on my own thoughts and experiences surrounding my faith, and like how it relates to loss, tragedy, and grief. So overall, I think it was a great book that made connections between grief and loss, between faith-based people of faith-based backgrounds and how they can relate or deal with tragedies. And I just think that it was a beneficial book for me to read to reflect on my own thoughts and experiences, as well as to build understanding or empathy for how maybe future clients of mine that come from this background that experience grief or loss and how to support them. So to conclude, these were my thoughts and my reflections on the book When Bad Things Happen to Good People by Harold Kushner. I greatly appreciated how this book helped to reframe perspectives on the relationship between God and tragedy. And I think it was a beneficial book for me to read to help self-reflect on the questions that I experience of why bad things happen to people, and what else might be more helpful or more comforting to consider after a tragedy of like, what do we do now, or who do we have to help us through this? So I would recommend this book to others, especially people who have